On Tuesday, the Financial Times published a report that made the whole world sit up and take notice. President Donald Trump had just returned from a high-profile trip to China, where he held extensive talks with his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping. During those talks, FT claimed that Xi Jinping had remarked that Russian President Vladimir Putin might end up regretting his invasion of Ukraine. That's a sensational statement. Understandably, it made headlines around the world and provoked a flurry of analysis and commentary. In an op-ed for CNN, Brett H. McGurk made the case that new trends on the battlefield suggest that Xi is right, and that his revelation offers a new chance for Trump's diplomacy to end the war, but with a different approach than what he's tried before. Let's unpack McGurk's argument and what it suggests about where the war is headed. If you've been following US politics for the last couple of decades, McGurk should be no stranger. He's a prominent American diplomat and attorney who has held senior national security positions under 4 presidents: George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden. He most recently served as Deputy Assistant to President Biden and as National Security Council Coordinator for the Middle East and North Africa. In that role, he led complex diplomatic efforts, including negotiations for a ceasefire in Gaza and the release of hostages held by Hamas. Previously, he served as the Special Presidential Envoy for the Global Coalition to counter ISIL under Presidents Obama and Trump, leading an international coalition that played a key role in the territorial defeat of ISIL in Iraq and Syria. Further back, he was a key architect of the 2007 Iraq surge strategy under President Bush and helped negotiate the US-Iraq security agreement. So although his expertise is primarily in the Middle East theater, he's certainly extremely well versed in complex negotiations and what it takes to conclude them from a strong position. In his op-ed for CNN, where he's a regular global affairs analyst, he makes the case that Xi's comments present an opportunity for Trump to pressure Russia into cutting a deal, and why new realities on the battlefield should swing the terms of the deal firmly in Ukraine's favor. Now, it's worth noting that both Trump and senior Chinese officials have flatly denied that Xi said anything of the sort. FT says Xi's comments were reported by several people familiar with the US assessment of the Beijing summit. It doesn't name them. However, in the same article, it also notes that the Chinese Foreign Ministry had called the report completely false, and that Trump had told reporters, "No, he never said that." The White House's fact sheet on the Beijing summit also contained no reference to conversations about Putin or the war in Ukraine. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Guo Jiakun later doubled down on the denial, telling reporters that the information you mentioned does not match the facts and is completely fabricated out of thin air. Indeed, it's rare to see such a blunt statement from the Chinese leader, who is typically much more cautious with his words. The FT article admits that, according to its sources, the comment goes much further than any he made about the situation in Ukraine during Xi's conversations with Trump's predecessor, Joe Biden. Then again, Trump has also stated that during the same summit, Xi had told him that the US was a nation in decline, a statement that Trump says he agreed with. That would also be uncharacteristically blunt of Xi, adding credence to FT's report. On the other hand, such a comment would almost certainly have created some awkwardness when Putin landed in Beijing this week for his own summit with Xi. No such awkwardness was visible. Instead, Russian and Chinese social media have been crowing about the fact that Putin took his jacket off during the proceedings. In Russian culture, this is apparently a sign that someone feels secure and at ease. So who really knows whether Xi actually said it or not? McGurk treats it as fact. More importantly, he says that current trends in the war support the statement. Putin had hoped that 2026 would be the year his forces, enabled by his advantage in mass and manpower, would break through the front lines and seize the contested regions in eastern Ukraine. But that has not happened, at least not yet. In fact, Russia appears to be going backwards. An assessment by the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, reveals that in April, Ukraine enjoyed a net territorial gain and Russia net territorial losses for the first time since Ukraine's incursion into Russia's Kursk region in 2024. Around 45 square miles of territory have been reclaimed, according to the report. The Economist's War Tracker also notes that from 2026 to date, Ukraine has enjoyed small but significant territorial gains for the first time since 2023. Those reports contrast sharply with what the Russian side says happened during the same period. Russian Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov recently claimed that Russian forces had seized about 656 square miles of territory, captured 80 settlements, and liberated the last remaining settlements in Luhansk Oblast during 2026. Geolocated footage released by the Russians seems to corroborate at least the last part of that statement. Call it the fog of war, call it propaganda, but there's another more gruesome statistic that supports net Ukrainian advances: exchanges of the dead between the two sides. The number of dead soldiers exchanged between the two sides has long been a challenge to Western and Ukrainian assertions that Russia's manpower losses far exceed Ukraine's. In some areas, those estimates have reached brain-melting proportions. For example, Ukrainian intelligence assessments in late 2025 estimated that as many as 27 Russian soldiers were killed for every Ukrainian lost during the slow capture of the city of Kupiansk, although Reuters was unable to verify that number. This week, the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Alexander Syrskyi, placed the overall loss ratio significantly lower. In terms of those killed, depending on the day, the ratio reaches 7 or 9 times. That is the ratio of fatalities, he said. That may be 3 times lower than the figure claimed for Kupiansk, but it's still extreme. A military rule of thumb is that an attacking force typically needs a manpower advantage of 3 to 1 to have a good chance of succeeding in an offensive. That estimate rises to 5 to 1 when an area is heavily fortified. These ratios imply that an attacking force suffers more casualties than defenders, and that's typically the case. So 7 or 9 to 1 would represent appalling losses for the Russians. Independent Western analysts are usually more restrained in their estimates. Sources like the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, puts the number at around 2.5 to 1 in Russia's favor for total casualties, including killed, wounded, and missing, with a higher ratio in Ukraine's favor for fatalities alone. The problem is that exchanges of dead between the two sides have been heavily stacked in the other direction. Regular exchanges of the dead have been taking place since Russia's invasion in 2022, according to data compiled from official sources by the Russian war loss tracker Lost Armor. In total, Russia has returned 24,955 Ukrainian bodies and received 3,450 in return. That's a total exchange ratio of 7.23 dead Ukrainians for each Russian dead. In 2026 to date, 3,528 Ukrainians have been returned in exchange for 155 Russians, a ratio of 22.76 to 1. That's significantly lower than the numbers exchanged in 2025, where 16,304 Ukrainians were exchanged for 439 Russians, a ratio of 37.14 to 1. Most pertinently, in the latest exchange, which took place last week, 526 Ukrainians were exchanged for 41 Russians. That's still a ratio of 12.8 to 1. But the more or less monthly exchanges have been hovering around the 1,000 to 10 to 20 mark for some time. The Ukrainian side has long claimed that the reason for the great disparity is twofold. Firstly, they have claimed that the Russians are inflating the numbers by including some of their own dead or body parts of previously partially returned fallen soldiers. But their main claim has been that since the Russians have been advancing, they have been able to collect the fallen and capture positions while Ukraine hasn't had the same opportunity, thereby artificially increasing the ratio. In the latest exchange, the number of Russians doubled from recent months while the number of Ukrainians practically halved. Using Ukraine's arguments, this suggests that Ukraine is indeed starting to advance on the battlefield, collecting dead Russians as it moves into their formerly held positions. McGurk argues that as a result of the stalled Russian offensive and Ukrainian gains, the pressure is becoming visible inside Russia itself. In fact, there's now open grumbling about the cost of the war. In recent days, in a rare display of public dissent, Russian parliamentarian Renat Suleymanov warned that Russia's economy cannot sustain a prolonged war in Ukraine. He noted that 40% of the federal budget is now allocated to defense and security, 1.5 times more than total social spending. Suleymanov argued that this massive spending fuels inflation, crowds out investment and social programs, and creates long-term economic distortions, noting that tanks and shells have no consumer value. It's these types of comments that usually result in someone accidentally falling from a 24th floor window. It's brave of Suleymanov to make them so publicly, and a sure sign of the increasing pressure on the Russian economy as a result of the prolonged war. Another clear sign is Putin's plummeting approval rating. Russian state pollster VTSIOM reports that Putin's approval rating fell to 65.6% in late April 2026, the lowest level recorded since the beginning of the war against Ukraine. That's a significant decline of over 12 percentage points from December 2025, which prompted the state-controlled polling agency to revise its survey methodology for future narrative control. McGurk argues that a key factor in this pressure is Ukraine's drones, which he calls the force multiplier. Ukraine today does not look like a defending state trying to survive, but a military innovator reshaping the nature of warfare through mass-produced autonomous systems, he writes. This has flipped the assumption from the start that Russia's manpower advantage alone would be decisive. Along the front lines, Ukraine has now established a 10 to 15 kilometer, 6.2 to 9.3 mile, kill zone, where Russia is unable to advance without exposure to constant drone attacks. That's true, but it's not necessarily a compelling argument. According to the Pentagon Inspector General's latest quarterly report on Operation Atlantic Resolve, Russia has achieved relative parity in tactical drone deployment. The report also states that Russia almost certainly retains a higher ability to conduct persistent, high-tempo offensive maneuvers and holds the advantage in direct fires, logistics, force generation, and force protection. If daily updates on the most important military stories are what you're after, click the subscribe button now. On The Military Show, we don't just copy-paste the headlines, we dig deep to bring you the real story and why it matters. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss out. Bottom line, Russia has established the same kill zones across the front lines, and it's just as difficult and costly for Ukrainian forces to advance through them as it is for the Russians. But while the front lines might be somewhat of a stalemate in terms of drone warfare, Ukraine's long-range strikes deep inside Russia are certainly escalating and taking an increasingly heavy toll. To use McGurk's words, Ukrainian drones are now routinely striking deep into Russia, targeting military airfields, factories, energy infrastructure, ammunition depots, and logistics hubs. The ability of Ukrainian drones to reach Moscow reportedly contributed to Putin's interest in a temporary ceasefire during Victory Day commemorations in the capital, allowing a parade without threats of drones appearing from nowhere and ruining the spectacle. If anything, he's downplaying just how much of a problem these Ukrainian drone strikes have become in recent times. Over the past 2 years, the number of Ukrainian long-range drone launches has been steadily increasing, and in recent months it's gone through the roof. That's both figuratively and in the case of many Russian facilities being struck, quite literally. From 110 UAVs in January 2024, the figure rose to more than 7,000 in March 2026, with the total number of launches multiplying fivefold over the course of 2025 alone. In March, Ukraine overtook Russia in the number of long-range drones launched in a month for the first time. Recently, Russian officials reported the largest attack on the capital in more than a year, with air defenses intercepting more than 550 drones. Over 1,000 drones were launched in that single wave, targeting the Moscow region and other areas deep inside Russia. As McGurk correctly notes, these attacks are now forcing Russia to disperse air defenses, relocate aircraft, harden infrastructure, and devote increasing resources to homeland defense. In military terms, Ukraine is expanding the battle space and raising the costs of the war for Moscow. At the same time, Moscow is struggling to gain any territory on the battlefield in Ukraine. Putin, McGurk says, is being forced to confront a strategic defeat. Offensive wars are ultimately judged not by lines on a map, but on whether they meet the political aims for which they were launched in the first place, he writes. Putin's war aims at the time of the invasion included the full subordination of Ukraine, weakening NATO as an alliance, and restoring Russia as a dominant Eurasian power. Those aims are increasingly out of reach for Moscow. In terms of subordinating Ukraine entirely, McGurk says, the battlefield and outcome of the war is now focused on the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine, with no chance for Russian forces to seize Kyiv, Putin's initial objective. While the front lines are brutally active way beyond the Donbas, in Kharkiv, Sumy, Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson oblasts, the basic sentiment is correct. Unless Russia mobilizes a massive reserve army and embarks on a major new offensive through Belarus, an event both Zelensky and Syrskyi have been warning about in recent days, there is little evidence that Russia has the capabilities to attempt to take Kyiv. So can Russia re-establish itself as a dominant Eurasian power? It depends on who you ask. While some like McGurk say such a prospect is increasingly out of reach, at their recently concluded summit in Beijing, Putin and Xi both seem to have missed the memo. During the summit, the two signed a joint declaration on the formation of a multipolar world, which Russia and China intend to spearhead. The 47-page policy document was signed at the Great Hall of the People, alongside approximately 40 other cooperation agreements. It calls for a world order based on respect for sovereignty, equal state relations, and opposition to expanding military alliances like NATO and AUKUS, which it likens to the law of the jungle. The leaders position their strategic partnership as a model for major powers and a counterweight to what they described as US unilateral and hegemonic countercurrents. In terms of weakening NATO, there is a case to be made that in some sense the alliance has been weakened in recent times, although it's highly debatable whether Russia has had anything to do with that. Trump has never been a particularly big fan of NATO. He and senior members of administration like Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Secretary of War Pete Hegseth have made a number of statements calling into question what they see as the US's oversized contributions to the alliance. Trump was particularly unhappy about the unwillingness of the US's European NATO partners to join his conflict with Iran and his efforts to unblock the Strait of Hormuz, which Iran closed in retaliation for the US and Israel's attacks. In April, Trump threatened to reduce the US role in NATO or even withdraw from the alliance if its members did not help to reopen the strait. Then again, there's an even stronger case to be made that Putin's invasion of Ukraine has actually strengthened the alliance, not weakened it. As McGurk writes, the NATO alliance, despite rhetorical critiques from Trump, is larger today than when Russia invaded. Finland and Sweden have joined the alliance, and arguably stronger, with increases in defense spending throughout NATO's European capitals. Thus, despite enormous and mounting losses for Russia, Putin has little to show for his war in Ukraine, and the trends appear only to be worsening month by month, he concludes. Having detailed why he believes Russia is in a weak position and thus vulnerable to a disadvantageous war settlement, McGurk then gets into the meat of his argument: what it means for China and how Trump could leverage this to force a settlement on Putin. While Xi has ordered the People's Liberation Army to be ready for an operation to seize Taiwan by 2027, he writes, his military remains untested by combat, and Ukraine is proving the difficulty of achieving rapid political collapse against a determined defender. Over the next 6 months, Xi will be examining these trends and sizing up advantages and disadvantages when it comes to his ultimate designs on Taiwan. McGurk feels that this provides the US with a golden opportunity to reinforce Xi's caution and stamp the boot down hard on Putin's throat. The smart move right now is to reinforce NATO and its support for Ukraine, to demonstrate to Putin that he has no chance to regain momentum, and to Xi that moves on Taiwan will be met with a coordinated response. As he correctly points out, Trump's stated objective on Ukraine is to end the war through a diplomatic settlement, which would likely require Ukraine to accept land concessions in exchange for security guarantees. He also correctly notes that diplomacy has floundered because Ukraine has been unwilling to give up land that it believes it can defend militarily, while Russia still believes it can seize the land militarily. Displaying all his experience as a seasoned negotiator, he succinctly notes that breakthrough negotiations rarely succeed when both sides feel equally confident and with time favoring their longer-term objectives. But now, with trends turning in Ukraine's favor, McGurk feels that the underlying assumptions behind this deadlock no longer apply. The assumption underlining Trump's diplomacy, based on his own statements, has been that Ukraine, as the smaller power, must make concessions at the table or else it will lose the war on the battlefield. That assumption, once questionable, is now false, he writes. The new realities on the battlefield present a new opportunity for diplomacy to succeed. Ukraine is now more confident in its own defense and less dependent upon promises from Washington for its future defense. Russia now faces a future of mounting casualties and economic strain for no chance of a breakthrough. According to McGurk, that resets the table. As might be expected, efforts by the US to broker a settlement have more or less come to a standstill since the US began Operation Epic Fury against Iran. The US side has understandably been somewhat preoccupied with more pressing concerns. The last formal round of US brokered talks on the conflict took place in February. There has been little activity since, but that may soon change. Yuri Ushakov, one of Putin's most influential aides, stated on May 20th that the US chief negotiators concerning Ukraine, Steve Witkoff and Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner, were expected in Russia in the coming weeks. McGurk feels that Trump should seize the opportunity to strike while the iron is hot. For Trump, the best chance to end the war now lies in not assuming Ukrainian weakness, as Trump has done to date, but in recognizing Russia's increasing vulnerability. There is now leverage to force a settlement on terms acceptable to Ukraine, and Washington should use it, he concludes. We'll conclude this video on that note too. Needless to say, we will of course be following the story closely and keep you updated in our daily reports. In the meantime, for a more thorough look at Russia's casualties during the war, check out this video. And thank you as always for watching.